I don't think I need to introduce Andrew Berman, but this is Andrew Berman, who is going to tell us about the Society's plan for proposal for rezoning the South Village. No further ado.
Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for turning out tonight.
So with that little bit of applause, let me just say that's the end of the applause. we have a very big agenda. We have a lot of another thing after this. We've got to be out of here by 9 o'clock. So we're gonna speed forward, and if you can cut back a little bit on your time.
I'll try to be as quick as I can. So the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation would like to see the South Village's R72 zone rezoned, and Ted, if you can go to the next slide. The purpose of this is to help preserve the character of the neighborhood and to prevent bad development. The South Village's R72 zoning district dates to 1961, a much different era in planning. And the zoning district for this area actually encourages completely out-of-scale high-rise development. So we'd like to see the zoning changed, and that's what we're proposing. And this is a very initial step in that direction. Hopefully tonight the community board will like what they hear and they will decide they want to support this effort. And we're here to give more information to the board and to the public about it. Next slide, please. Okay. So this map here, which if you guys got the handout, it's in there as well. This is the R72 zone in the South Village. We did not draw those boundaries, which I'm sure look pretty crazy to you. Those are the boundaries of the existing district. Outside of that district, there are different zoning districts that have very different issues attached to them, but they are different than the R72 zoning district. Our proposal is just for this district, and I'll explain as we move ahead why we are focused just on this district. So the boundaries, we didn't create them, we inherited them from the city. We're seeking to change them and turn them into something better. Next slide. So this is an overview, an aerial view of the R72 zone. As I said, it dates to 1961. These are the problems with it. There are no height limits in the R72 zoning district. It's meant to encourage high rises surrounded by open space. It has a very large community facility bulk bonus, and what that means is, under the zoning, you're allowed to build one size of building if it's a residential building, but if it's a building that includes dorms, university facilities, things of that nature, you can build a much larger building, about 90% larger. And it doesn't even have to be entirely a dorm or a university facility. You can just put some of those in there, or you can claim that you're going to put some of those in there, and you get this 90% bonus in terms of how big you can build. Currently, it's a 6.5 FAR. For those of you who are familiar with FAR, you know what that means. If you're not, don't worry about it, we can explain it later, as compared to 3.44 for residential. What we would like to see in the South Village R72 zone is a contextual zoning district. Contextual zones have height limits. They have street wall requirements, so instead of building these big tall towers with lots of open space around them that doesn't really serve anybody in any meaningful way, it keeps buildings like the old-fashioned buildings built out to the street wall, and it eliminates the community facility bulk bonus. We see all of these as good things. Next slide. Now, this is a map of the R72 districts showing the parts of it that are currently landmarked. So a good chunk of the South Village's R72 zone is now landmarked, thanks to the efforts of many of the people in this room fighting very hard over the last 10 years, but certainly not all of it is. South of Houston Street, virtually none of it is, and that's an area that's under an extreme amount of pressure. And even north of Houston Street, if you look closely, you can see, those of you who followed the effort to get the South Village Historic District designated, the city cut out that entire block on the north side of Houston Street between McDougal and Sullivan Street. There's some NYU facilities up in the top there where the Kimmel Center is that were not included in the landmark district for obvious reasons. There's sites along 6th Avenue in that upper portion there north and south of 3rd Street that are not landmarked. Now, as we'll get to a little bit later, even for the areas that are landmarked, you want to have zoning that encourages and reinforces what landmarking is supposed to do, which is to preserve the character of the neighborhood. So even if this was all landmarked, I would say it would still be a good thing to get contextual zoning. For the non-landmarked areas, it's especially vital, because until and unless they are landmarked, we're going to keep seeing 15, 20, or more story buildings built there, replacing the 2 to 6 story buildings that typically characterize this neighborhood. Next, please. So this is directly from the Department of City Planning's website. This shows you what an R72 zone encourages. That's a 19-story building. They're using an East Village site as an example, but it's the same zoning. That's what could be built on a site very similar to one in the South Village. Just ask if it's possible to lift the projector up a little bit. The bottom's getting cut off. So this also from the Department of City Planning shows you where it says height factor building, the tall tower, that's what R72 encourages, whereas those little buildings next to it, those are the kinds of buildings that we have in the South Village for the most part, and that we want to keep and reinforce. Next, please. So this is Silver Towers. Silver Towers was built under the R72 zone. This is a perfect example of what the R72 zone allows. It fits the R72 envelope perfectly. That's why NYU sought to and got the zoning for it overturned, because they wanted to build more there, because the zoning actually allowed you to build this perfectly and nothing more. But that wasn't good enough for NYU. They wanted to build more. So this is an example of what can be built in an R72 zone. I love Silver Towers. I don't want to see more of them built in the South Village. It's a very different character. Next slide, please. Here are some examples of inappropriate development that have taken place in the neighborhood under the R72 zone. The Kimmel Center, Furman Hall. Next, please. 159 Bleecker Street, a lot of folks know this. This one, and the building is so out of scale that it's actually cut off at the top of the picture here. What's particularly pernicious about this and speaks to the problem with the R72 zone is they were able to build such a large building here partly because they claimed that there was going to be this community facility in there. The community facility never materialized. Then they tried to get all of these things that don't actually qualify as community facilities in there. Like there was a Dalton faculty housing scheme, which was torpedoes, as many of you probably remember, because it was illegal. You were not allowed to do it. So what you see a lot of developers in zones that have these community facility bonuses do is they say, oh yeah, I'm going to build a building, it's going to have some residential units, and it's going to have some community facilities in it. So give me the extra bonus because of that. They then build the building, and the community facility never materializes. If you get rid of that bonus, you eliminate that incentive for this sort of chicanery. Next, please. This is on the corner of LaGuardia Place and West 3rd Street, another example of what can be built in the R72 zone. As you can see from the buildings next to it, completely out of scale and character. Next, please. This is a building going up now on, I think it's called One Van Dam. Again, another example. This is encouraged and allowed by the R72 zoning in the neighborhood. Next, please. Now, this is a case where we actually sort of dodged a bullet. This is the community, this is the Children's Aid Society site. This is what could have been built under the existing zoning. They chose to do something a little more modest. I actually have it on good authority that they were strongly encouraged by some people in city government to do that. But it would have perfectly been within their rights to have built in this manner on that site. Next, please. Now, these are, we, using the zoning rules, we created some diagrams showing what could be built in the South Village's R72 under the existing zoning. Now, this is St. Anthony's. Not saying the church is being sold or torn down or anything like that, but it's a nice big site, and if someday something like that happened, this is what could be built on the site of St. Anthony's. This is a building that would reach 290 feet in height to the top of the mechanicals. This is not fantasy, this is what the zoning allows. Next, please. This is just the same site from a couple of different angles. Next one. Next one. Okay. So this now is the site on the north side of north side of Houston Street that I mentioned before, between McDougal and Sullivan Street, facing McDougal-Sullivan Gardens, that block that the city did not include in the South Village Historic District, even though we fought very hard to get it in there. This is what could be built on that site under the existing zoning. A building that could go up to 263 feet high. This is not with a zoning variance, this is not with some special approvals. This is as of right, no public review, just doing what the zoning allows you to do. Next, please. Same thing from another angle. You can see how it sticks out like a sore thumb in the neighborhood. We don't want to get to the point where this is actually being planned, because at that point, it's pretty much too late to stop it. You have to do this sort of thing, changing the zoning proactively to prevent this from happening, or one day you wake up and this is what does happen. Next, please. And that's just another angle on the same thing. Now, this is a similar projection that we did of what could have been built on the Vanderbilt Hall site on Washington Square South. Now, we did manage to get this in the South Village Historic District, so hopefully, and just go to the next slide, Ted. Hopefully this will never happen because it's in a landmark district, and any new construction there would be subject to the approval of the Landmarks Preservation Commission. The Landmarks Preservation Commission, we usually agree with what they do. Sometimes we disagree. Sometimes we strongly disagree. Sometimes they surprise us with what they do. And Ted, if you can go to the next slide. So this is a building that the Landmarks Preservation Commission did approve in the Greenwich Village Historic District. So rather than simply relying on the 90 to 95% of the time when the Landmarks Preservation Commission makes decisions that we might agree with, for the 5 or 10% of the time that they might make a decision, especially with a well-connected and powerful institution that we might not agree with, it's good to have zoning that reinforces our desire to keep an appropriate scale of development in the neighborhood. Next, please. This is actually something that was approved by the Landmarks Preservation Commission as well, but was never built because we got a rezoning and the project was supposed to go through just as the big crash of late 2008, so it was put on hold, and now it will never be built as a result. It's the rare case that you're able to get a rezoning in to stop a development. Usually you have to be ahead of the curve in order to do that. So if you look over here on the right-hand side, those little buildings next to it, that's Perry Street between Washington and Greenwich. You can see this was a hotel, very out of scale, which was actually approved by the Landmarks Preservation Commission. So yet another example of why you don't want to rely 100% on something being in a historic district. It's not an absolute guarantee. Next, please. So these are the key factors for what you want to look at in terms of being able to get a rezoning to happen, in my opinion. The first is the simpler the better. And our proposal is very simple. We take an existing zone and we change it to a contextual zoning district. So we keep it very, very simple. There are no changes that we're proposing in terms of the allowable uses. If you get into zoning, changing allowable uses in districts, it becomes a much more complicated problem. And in all honesty, the uses are not really the issues in the R7-2 zone. The issue is the height and bulk and the community facility bulk bonus. I also just want to say, and you'll see the specifics in a minute of what we're proposing, the specifics that we're proposing are not what we sat down and said, in our ideal world, this is what should be the limits of what can be built there. It would be a very different conversation if that was a practical approach to take. What we did was we looked at existing zoning districts, because if you want to create a new zoning district from scratch that doesn't exist, again, it's a really long, complicated process with much less chance of success. This is really the practical way to go. And similarly, looking for precedents. Again, we could look at a zoning district that the city has never considered in some place like Manhattan, has never considered an appropriate alternative for an R7-2 zone. It might be more restrictive and more in line with what we personally think would be appropriate. But if it's not something that the city has ever done or shown any inclination to do, it's not likely to be successful. So these are the things that we looked at in terms of trying to come up with a rezoning proposal. Next slide, please. So speaking of precedent, the East Village was zoned almost entirely R7-2 and had the exact same issues: out-of-scale development, community facility bulk bonuses. In 2008, GVSHP, working with a coalition of groups and elected officials and the local community board, pushed and got a rezoning of the East Village, basically getting rid of the entire R7-2 zone, except for one housing development in the middle that looks a lot like Silver Towers, Towers in the Park. And that zoning district included R7As and R7Bs, which is what we're proposing for the South Village. So we're not coming up with any sort of crazy harebrained scheme that nobody's ever considered before. This is well grounded in precedent in what the city has done in recent years. Next, please. Somewhat similarly, a couple of years ago, we were able to successfully push to get the C61 zone in the Far West Village rezoned to a contextual zone. That one was a little more complicated or a little bit different because it was a zoning district that allowed commercial development. But factoring out the commercial development, it's exactly the same thing that we're proposing here. It was 6.5 FAR for community facilities, just like the R72 zone. There was a 6 FAR for commercial, which is not an issue in the R72 zone. 3.44 max for residential development. It became a C16A, which is what we proposed and we got. 4 FAR community facility, 4 FAR residential, 2 FAR commercial. It's the equivalent of an R7A zone, which, as you'll see, is what we're proposing for part of the South Village. Next, please. And similarly, a couple of years before that, in 2005, we also successfully pushed for rezoning in the sort of farther west part of the Far West Village. The zoning designations were different, again, because of the commercial aspect, and this is mostly geared towards the community board. But again, what we're talking about or suggesting here is not unprecedented. It's what we have been able to achieve over the last several years in and around our neighborhood. Next, please. So, this is a diagram, again, from the Department of City Planning showing up on top what the R72 zone encourages. And below, this shows what the 2 zoning districts that we're proposing for the South Village's R72 zone would allow. An R7A on wide streets. And the reason why we say wide streets is because the city has sort of a policy. If a site is on a wide street, they feel like it can withstand a little bit larger development. And if it's on a narrow street, as the city defines it, they think the scale of development should be a little smaller. So we're proposing an R7A for the wide streets and an R7B for the narrow streets. As you can see, and each one of those bands represents a floor. That's a lot more similar to the kind of development and buildings that we see in the South Village today. Next, please. So here is a map now, and this is also in the handout we handed out, showing what we would like to propose for this South Village R72 zone. R7A on the wide streets, Houston Street, LaGuardia Place, 6th Avenue, and then R7B on the narrower, smaller side streets. Next, please. And so this is a chart with a breakdown of exactly what these zoning districts would do. So again, starting from the top, this is what the current zoning does. It allows a residential FAR of 3.44 up to 4 with quality housing. And I'll just quickly say, for folks who aren't familiar with FAR, that means floor area ratio. It's the ratio of the number of square feet you can build as compared to the number of square feet on your lot. So for FAR, for instance, if you were to build straight up with no setbacks using 100% of your site, that's a 4-story building. Nobody ever builds straight up using 100% of their site with no setbacks. So just as an example, if you built on 50% of your lot at 4 FAR, that's an 8-story building, and so on. So just to give you an idea of what that means. FAR, by the way, as crazy as a measurement as that may sound like, this is the way the city measures zoning, so it's not our choice to think about it in these terms. That's what the city system does. So from our draft proposal, the R7A for wide streets, that allows a 4 FAR residential. Actually, I'm sorry, I didn't finish the R72. So currently the R72 is 6.5 community facility. The commercial FAR, it's when there's a commercial overlay, which means you can have stores and stuff on the ground floor. There's no height limit whatsoever, so you can build those 250 plus story buildings if you have a big enough site. Our R7A has 4 FAR for residential, 4 FAR for community facility, so the community facility bulk bonus is gone. Doesn't change anything about the commercial overlays, and it puts in place a base maximum height of 40 to 65 feet. So if you have like a roughly 10 foot per floor, that's a 4 to 6 story base, and you can set back so it's not quite as visible and go up to a maximum of 80 feet. Again, for a lot of these sites, if we had our druthers, it would be lower. Realistically, based on precedent, this is probably the best we could get from the city. And then for the narrow streets in R7B, 3 FAR residential, 3 FAR community facility, doesn't change the commercial uses in the ground floors at all, a 40 to 60 foot base height and a 75 foot maximum after setbacks. Again, looking at precedents, looking at what's realistic to do. Next slide, please. This is a map from just a couple of months ago that shows the many sites in the South Village that are currently facing development. So this is not theoretical. I don't have to tell folks here in the room. This neighborhood is certainly under siege and under an incredible amount of development pressure. The rezoning of Hudson Square next door only increased that. Now is really the time to do this. Next, please. So what happens from here? It's great that we have this proposal. We hope everybody in the room, especially the community board and elected officials, will love the idea. What happens from here? Ideally, what we want to do is we want to convince the Department of City Planning that this is a good idea as well, and for them to become the applicant for the proposed rezoning. That's our ideal goal. So if the Department of City Planning becomes the applicant, it goes through what's called the ULURP process, which is a fancy way of saying rezoning, which is this long process with many steps, comes back to the community board hears it and votes on it, goes to the borough president votes on it, both of those votes are advisory, then goes to the city planning commission, they vote on it, and their vote really counts. Now, if they're the applicant, and they themselves are voting on it, there's a pretty good chance you're going to succeed there. And then it goes to the city council, which also gets to vote on it, and in that process, some changes could be made. The advantages are it's swifter, it's cheaper, you have a greater likelihood of success. The downside of it is you're then giving the application to the Department of City Planning. They may say, well, we really like the idea, but we actually think the FAR should be 50% higher than you're suggesting it should be. And we think that on this side, this should be changed, and this side, this should be changed. So you sort of lose control. They don't generally do that just unilaterally. They know that if they then put it through the process, and the community that asks for it is then saying, hey, we don't want this anymore, they know that it's probably not going to succeed. So I'm not saying you give it to them and then you have no power over it whatsoever, but you're no longer the applicant, and there can be a greater likelihood of changes being made. So the next steps to go this route, which is what we hope would happen, is getting support from the community board. That's absolutely essential. Followed by hopefully getting support from elected officials, most importantly the city council members and the borough president, because they have a formal role in the land use process, but certainly very important, and we want the support of our state assembly member and our state senators, actually, this is in 2 districts, and then you go to meet with the Department of City Planning and say, hey, we got this great idea, we hope you think it's great too, how can we make it happen? Next slide, please. The less ideal route, if the Department of City Planning doesn't seem like they want to take this on themselves and be the applicant, is any private entity can apply for a zoning change. And the community board sees many private entities that come before you for zoning changes. Typically, it's because they want more and bigger development, because they own a property.
And can I just interrupt for the sake of time?
This is
You're
my
not
last slide.
asking, okay,
Yeah.
because you're not asking us to propose it.
No. No, but I just want to quickly run through what would happen if we had to go that route. So a private entity such as GVSHP could be the applicant. The Department of City Planning decides the scope of the review, and they can make it very long and difficult. It goes through the scoping process, and then it goes through the ULURP process, blah, blah, blah. Long story short, it's a longer, much more expensive process with no guarantee of approval, because you're ultimately bringing it to a body that said, hey, we didn't want to necessarily take this on in the first place. You can succeed. There are private applications for rezonings that are approved by the city all the time. It's definitely the less ideal. The one upside is you control the application, so the Department of City Planning is not going to change the application for you and turn it into something that you don't like. Next steps are exactly the same. We would still want and need the community board support in order to move this ahead, and our elected officials, and we'd still need to meet with the Department of City Planning to say this is something where we'd like to do and we want to at least work with you. Ted, is that the last slide? That is the last slide. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you. I think I kept your time.
Yes, thank you.
What do you think was the original rationale for creating that big community facility bonus?
Yeah, you know, we've talked to a lot of people about the thinking of the community facility bulk bonus, and you know, there are a lot of districts that don't have large bonuses. So I think the thinking was a couple of things. One was this was thought of as NYU territory. The idea was let the university expand. I think the idea also was that the community facility bulk bonus allows some kinds of necessary or desirable services to have sort of a leg up and to be able to sort of be built. I think over time, virtually everybody agrees the way they chose to do that is a system that's fraught with abuse. And it's most typically used by the least desirable of community facilities, university dorms and things like that. But I think that was the thinking behind it.
But they were for, excuse me, you gotta do committee.
And the rationale, LaGuardia is somewhat wider, but although it has 2 lanes, it's not that much wider. And you've got the LaGuardia Community Gardens right across the street, so you go to 15 feet higher there.
So the city defines in law wide street and narrow street. We didn't pick the definitions, and the measurements of LaGuardia Place are a wide street under the city's legal definition. So now that's not, it's that R7A, there's no, R7A is not wedded to wide streets and R7B is not wedded to narrow streets. We think on what the city considers a wide street, and R7A is the best we're gonna get. And I think the R7B for the narrow streets is gonna be a heavy lift, but at least we can say it's a narrow street. I would gladly have an R7B on LaGuardia Place. Realistically, I don't think that would even, there's no wide, I don't think there's any wide street in Manhattan that the city has ever zoned that way or remotely left.
Others? Me? Just one question about, you know, small portions of this part of the South Village are actually M15A and B.
Not what we're proposing to.
I know that, but most people don't even realize where that line is because contextually it's the same, and particularly above Broom Street, it's the same. Any thoughts? I understand you don't want to complicate it by including those, but any thoughts about how to protect those?
Yeah, I think that it's very worth thinking about rezoning at least parts of the M15A zone in the South Village as well as potentially other places. You know as well as anyone, there's a boatload of issues connected to the M15 zones, the M15A and the M15B. It would make this a exponentially more complicated process. We would be happy to work with and advocate for a change in that zone. I think a lot more people need to be around the table for that, and a lot more issues need to be addressed in terms of figuring out how to make that happen, but I agree with you.
Okay, so we're going with questions here. Yes, Stu?
Yeah, in terms of the 2 ways to approach this, we're going to have a new head of city planning who was involved with Trinity Real Estate before, and he's clearly said that, you know, he's made statements about density and height not being an issue, and really affordable housing being important, which everybody would agree with. We just saw a proposal of a building that just went up, that just got a very large bonus. My concern is if we leave it to this city planning to shepherd it through, the changes that will be made might not be to our liking.
Well, let me say this, with anything there's risk. There are upsides and downsides to each. We've thought about this long and hard. The downsides to trying to do it as a private applicant, I think, are much greater. Your chances of success are dramatically diminished. And I'll just say with the East Village, with all of the rezonings that we discussed here, all of them were initiated by the community where, like through this process, community groups said, hey, we want to see rezoning, this is what we want to see happen, this is what we want. They brought it to city planning, and city planning became the applicant. There was some tug of war and give and take there, but ultimately in every one of the cases, people were happy with the outcome. So I would just say from my experience, I think there's a much greater chance of success with the city as the applicant than with us as an applicant. I'd love for GVSHP to be the applicant and say, hey, we rezoned this. I just think that that's a route you want to go only if you're forced into it.
Would that be a 197A that you're talking about if you were to sponsor it?
It doesn't have to be 197. You can, just like a private developer, you can be an applicant for a rezoning.
Okay, other questions? First, yeah, Jonathan, go ahead.
Yeah, Andrew, one of the issues when the day comes this is presented is going to be preserving those borders, right? Because there might be some pushback as to making it agreeing to the rezoning but in a smaller area, right? Is that something you would anticipate could be an issue here?
So you're saying, is it possible that the city could say, yes, we support it, but we want to shrink the boundaries
Yes.
somewhat? Anything is possible.
Has that happened before?
Yes, with the East Village rezoning, there was a piece of the East Village that they didn't want to include in there, and they didn't include it the first time around, and then we went back and we got them to include that small piece the second time around. Anything is possible. I'll just say this, in terms of the issue of the risk, I would say the biggest risk with going the route of asking the city to be the applicant is that at the end of the day, you don't agree on things and it falls apart. There's not that much risk that they're gonna change it into something that you say is unacceptable, and yet they're gonna push it through. Because the whole point is they're looking to push through, they're looking to advance a rezoning that they believe the community will accept. They may try to slip a couple of things in there that you wouldn't ask for, but they think that on balance you'll accept. That's typically what they do, and then you make some tough choices about whether or not you can live with that or you can't live with that. But there's very little chance that you're gonna wake up one day and be like, oh my God, I got a rezoning that I never would have supported and I don't want at the end of the day.
Yes. Right.
To what extent does the university's nightmare plan fit in with your proposal?
Well, the area we're proposing to rezone doesn't overlap with the NYU's 2031 plan. For a variety of reasons, that's no longer an R72 zone, so it's a different zoning district. As we all know, a judge made what we think is a very wise decision, putting a big thing in the way. However, as NYU itself said, or wouldn't say through the process, regardless of whether or not the 2031 stuff goes through, there's nothing to stop NYU from continuing to do here what they've done over the last several years, which is buy up property, tear them down, and build hideous new things in their place. That's why we need this. It's one of the reasons why we need it. And that's a way in which it will definitely impact NYU. It will keep this from becoming more of what we've seen happen in other areas as a result of NYU's expansion.
Okay, now, are there any comments either for or against?
Yeah, I'm Dick Blodgett, Charles Street Block Association. We totally support this. Our directors voted unanimously to support this and asked the community vote to support it.
What? Yeah, I will. Okay, before we go through like a lot of statements in favor, is there anyone who's here today to oppose it? Okay, and could I have a show of hands for everybody who supports it? Okay, and, good, so my guess is that the committee also found it very convincing. So with that said, are there any other comments?
I have a question.
Yes.
Does this mean you're giving up on landmarking it?
That's a great question, and the answer is an absolute no. We are continuing to push. The current Landmarks Preservation Commission has expressed an enormous amount of resistance to landmarking the third phase south of Houston Street. They were equally resistant to landmarking the second phase, but we made that happen anyway. Presumably, there will be a new chair of the Landmarks Preservation Commission. Hopefully, they will have a different perspective on it. Even if there isn't, we will continue to push for this, and this only reinforces that effort. As I said before, even if this entire district were landmarked, we would still want to have better zoning in place. But especially since we don't know if or when that's going to happen, we need to get this better zoning.
Hi, I'm Mark Fiedler, past Secretary of BAMRA. Last month, we unanimously passed a resolution in favor of these proposals, and I want that to go on record.
Okay.
Sylvia Rackow, the Committee to Preserve Our Neighborhood. Absolutely in favor.
Thank you. Yes.
Toby, did you say the committee is not going to vote on this proposal?
Yes, we are going to vote on it. I believe we are. What?
You're going to vote tonight.
I believe we are, yes.
The Morton Street Block Association is another one of the sponsors, which I am representing. It also includes my first apartment in New York City.
That's not a compliment.
Andrew, what do you find, I know you're going to say you don't think so, what do you find more egregious, essentially more egregious? The community facility FAR or the height limitations? Consider the small lights, buildings that you showed us, I know they were community facility FARs that you were using for an example, I believe. you know, when it's a small lot, then it's the height of it. Is it 344 with, without polygons? Lot 7 is 344 with polygons, but.
Without, well, under certain circumstances in R72, you can go up to 4 with polygons,
Yeah.
if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, but so your proposal is to have 4 FAR, essentially for both communities, eliminate the community facility FAR. What do you find more egregious if you had to choose, and I know it's like choosing me, but because the small lots in the village, I just want to be realistic, the small lots in the village, you know, really limit, you know, what those 344 or 4 FAR can do. I always thought that the community facility FAR was totally at the same place. You have a sense of why it was more.
Well, I think they're both, it's sort of like a reverse Sophie's Choice. It's like, which one do I most want to kill? The community facility bulk bonus of 90% is crazy, and it just doesn't reflect kind of the reality of what's needed. The height limitations, as you said, on a small site, typically you can't do something that bad. It's when you accumulate more land, and that can happen. And that's where you get these really horrible, large buildings. But you know, in order for it to be that bad, there typically needs to be, I mean, you could do a purely residential building under R72 on a large lot and still have it be pretty bad. It's not going to get really terrible unless you use the community facility bulk bonus, which they do. There's almost nothing built in the R72 zone that is pure residential FAR. They always at least say there's some community facility in there just to bump up the
I agree with that. Okay, thank you. I just wanted to know what your feeling was if it came down to either one.
Hopefully it won't come down to that.
Yes, please.
There's no penalty for
Excuse me, it's calling somebody here, I'm calling you next.
Sure.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi. When a rezoning is in the process like this, when you're trying to push through something like this, is there any kind of halt put on the development while that thing is in negotiation? Or if it takes 2 years, during that 2 years, can developers just go in and build under the existing zoning?
So the answer to your first part of your question is no, and the answer to the second part of your question is yes, which was the reverse. So no, there is no halt that's put in place, and to be perfectly honest, we're not even really in the process. This is like, you know, sort of the twinkle in your eye stage of things. This is something we want to make happen. We hope we can get it to the point where it starts the actual process, which is at best, when you get to the sort of starting line, a 7th-month process. And we're still many steps away from there. And until the day that the city council votes it into law at the very last stage of the process, you are still allowed to get permits and do things under the old zoning. And then even after it passes, if you have an old permit and you can prove that you've already done some work under the old permit, you still get to build under the old zoning. So all the more reason why we want to start this as soon as possible and as early as possible, because it's very easy for people to try to get ahead of it.
Aside from the height, which we're all against in the development, the more than doubling of the size, I thought a community use facility was supposed to be a not-for-profit organization that was for the use of the community in some way that was beneficial. And I find it difficult to believe that there's no penalty to any building owner who doesn't comply with the application that he makes at all.
So there's 2 pieces to that. One is no, community facilities, believe it or not, do not have to be nonprofits. You know, something like a high-end plastic surgeon's office is a community facility. So there are community facilities that are nonprofits, that are great entities and institutions. There's good stuff in there. There's just a lot of not good stuff that's in there as well. We wanted the city to take a comprehensive approach of changing the definition of community facility. Under the Bloomberg administration, they didn't do that. I don't know how likely it is that it's going to happen too quickly under the de Blasio administration, if at all. So we're not putting our eggs all in that basket. There isn't a penalty for building the building. You're just supposedly not allowed to occupy it with something that's not a community facility if you were given the bonus for the community facility. But what they do is they come up with this crazy stuff that they claim is a community facility, and then it's incumbent upon the public to find out that it's not what they claim it is, report it to the Department of Buildings, get them to catch it, issue a violation, revoke the C of O. It's an awful process.
And even if they were probably illegally built, it's still to their benefit to build the rest of the building.
It's what happens.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we're gonna switch over to the Hudson River Park agenda. I guess we've got a slide